can be have an educative function in particular approaches like collaborative learning or simulation, embodied design, that sort of thing. And all the technology, of course, helps us connect with home or places outside school. And I also mentioned teachers and assessment before. A year later, I already mentioned this. We suddenly feel this need to know not a lot more about how technology is used for all those purposes that are so important in this year. I already mentioned WhatsApp as sort of dominant in some countries in education. And I would be really interested in more papers on the sort of lower level of technology. Sometimes I get the feeling that only very innovative uh, technology is interesting for readers, but I want to emphasize that I think we should also need to publish work that is really useful in particular constraints. This won't surprise you. Equity, especially in the Americas, is mentioned a lot. Somehow in Europe, the terms inclusion diversity seem to be more popular, but equity is definitely in the Americas the more dominant term and things that people want to achieve. Racism is a interesting one also because somehow in Europe people prefer to talk about discrimination, whereas racism is more United States, South Africa, and some other countries. So that's a whole topic in itself. But at least equity is sort of running through everything. It's a goal, it's part of approaches, it's something that teachers work with. So it's pervasive in that sense. And you won't be surprised here. This is what is mentioned perhaps most is what is really changing and more important in this year of the pandemic. People are worried about the digital divide, the widening achievement gaps, and people ask for research on how to remedy the consequence of the current pandemic, where some students in the world have not had any education or hardly any in the past months or months in a row. So a question asked by colleagues is how can we provide access to high quality math education for everyone? What should that look like? Especially if there are no teachers around or if your technology access is really low key. I hope you bear with me for another one or two topics. Affect, by that we mean all the sort of emotional issues, not separate from cognition, but motivation, love for mathematics, curiosity, all those kinds of things, mathematical identity or identity more broadly, and a counterpart in anxiety or the common alienation of mathematics that people feel as something strange to their daily lives and that are really anxious about, especially if they fail or don't have access to good education. And it's not surprising, of course, that in this year's comments we see more concern about student well-being than the year before. Assessment was a code that we added later. It was not so apparent in the first round, but of course, you need assessment to check if your goals have been achieved and to see how successful your approaches were. There's much more use of technology now, also at a distance, and that brings its own challenges. So, to give you a sense of the changes across the globe, if you see at the left the approaches, the categories, sorry, and the number of respondents who mentioned something in that category, you see that approaches to teaching are sort of the primary concern in the first round, 64%. of the respondents mentioned something about teaching approaches and a lot also about the goals. And I think that's a very interesting one because goals are often taken as sort of fixed and there, right? The government has set the goals and we can only help to achieve them. But there's a lot of discussion about goals, and it would be interesting to think what research could look like that helps us define those goals and operationalize them. Relation of math to other practices quite often mentioned, especially in Oceania, so Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, etc. Professional development, not surprisingly, technology, and the other things a little less, but not less important, I think. Now, a lot to digest. Give me a sec. I hope you have some paper and creative stuff with you. I have crayons and pencils and with Linda and others, I've been brainstorming of how to present all of this. List is not so nice, and matrix didn't work. The circle doesn't tell us much. So here is one attempt. You see the approaches that lead to goals. That's our interpretation, at least. And in that process, equity is sort of all around. Professional development covers it all. And in the middle, we've put technology as also having multiple roles. Assessment can be of approaches, but also of goals. And effect, also something that is rather pervasive in this whole process. And the yellow arrows represent the relations with of math education to the outside world, like home, work, citizenship, leisure, further education, you name it. So this is one attempt, and I hope that people will give their opinions either in the chat or later on. Here is another one which I tried this morning. Forgive my handwriting. Um, if we settle, we'll have it done in a better way. So what do we see here? A sort of road of approaches leading to particular goals. Along the road, we have assessment, and we have technology to bring us somewhere. The cars here, but also to connect with the outside world, to home, for instance. In the end, preparing for work or further education. From further education, people come back in teacher education, teacher professional development, and the teachers oversee this and help to improve those approaches. Um, the expertise of teachers has shown to be very, very important this year because we had to change so quickly to a new situation. And we've put equity, inclusion, diversity on top as sort of something that covers everything and should be in our minds always. So let's see if I missed something. I think I'm sort of okay. Um, Now, some general comments maybe then, and then we'll start a discussion. Uh, as you saw earlier, with high numbers of reinforced themes and specified themes, one nice summary, I think, is the pandemic sharpens essential questions on mathematics teaching. Everything is more urgent, is clearer visible. Inequity seems to be exacerbated. Discrepancy seems to have become worse, not only in schools. People struggle sometimes with languages um, and the availability of technology. Now, even though we asked for themes about research, we got a lot of comments on research itself. Actually, quite well, shocked is too much, but um, it was apparent that there were quite a lot of critical voices that think we should not just fill knowledge gaps, that a lot of research doesn't seem to help improve education, and that even research may perpetuate deficit discourse, by which people mean that if you study an achievement gap, say between particular groups of people, let's say white, brown, black, then people start to think that these groups perform differently and that's sort of their feature. And many people are worried about this deficit discourse of achievement gaps, and yet it's a problem that we need to address. There are comments about research being so tiny, atomistic, patch. Whereas if we want to improve education, we need something more holistic, integrative. People asked, can't ESM do more social, cultural, political issues, rather offer more than at least today? And I would be very happy with that. So, to close off with, um, of all the many, many, many themes, I've just picked a few. I think teacher professional development has been a key issue. I think we've all seen that this year. It's the teachers who make the shift, help students make the shift, have to learn technology very fast, use different technology, decide on their pedagogy or didactics. As I already hinted, many people feel that the goals of math education should change or be updated, and their curricula as well be a solid way to do this. It seems to be rather a political endeavor rather than something that is research based. And as a personal note, I was struck by how instrumental many comments were, like what math education should do, well, what how math could be an instrument in achieving things, where as I at least hope, and I think some with me, it should not be the only focus. For some students, at least, I think there is something to beauty and aesthetics. I'm nearly there. I feel we need to rethink the discipline, not just how things are, but also how things change and how we can change them, how we can avoid too narrow focus, and how we can pair up with other parties, and not only disciplines like science education or curriculum studies, but really something beyond disciplines, researchers plus policymakers plus educators. Um, and that's something that I think we need to think about if we really want to change something and not just know more. All right. It took longer than I thought, but I hope we'll have a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. It was a very interesting presentation, and also I think it must have raised a lot of questions with people. It's a good tradition of the mathematics education seminar that we try to spend at least half of the time on discussion, and Arthur has really stuck to this idea very well. We've got plenty of time to discuss the issues he raised, so I would be very happy to give anyone the opportunity to ask questions or make remarks. I was immediately triggered by your last slide where you mentioned that this is about mathematics education research, and you said some people said that the goal should not just be to increase our knowledge about education, but that we should change the world. And that's a very particular view on research.
Michiel has a hand, I see.
Yeah, but I'm not sure whether you first wanted to comment it on Rogier's remark. Or...
Well, I mean, as I said, what I said, sort of the first 28 minutes was more what we saw in the data, and the wish list was also a bit more personal colored. But I do sense it in the data that there is quite a lot of disappointment about this gap between knowing as a researcher and being useful to change educational practice, especially in times like these, where people see inequity and huge problems around them every day. And I feel we need to do more than increase our knowledge. We should.
I had a one very short factual question about the sheet where you displayed the remarks provided by the world parts. I had the feeling that there were a lot of, so in general, there were a lot of responses from Europe. But I had the feeling that in this overview, Europe was hardly visible. So were we so distributed among the topics? No, I mean the one where you mentioned first and mentioned as second. You are still muted. I'm not sure whether you...
Yeah, I'm. It's a bit further. This one, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is round 1, right? So let's see what you mean. Europe. Europe we're sort of evenly distributed, I would say. So no extremes.
Yeah.
So it would be close to the average everywhere.
So that's remarkable in a way. Yeah. That.
Well, if you think that's the highest number, if you think.
Yeah. Okay. Then it spreads out easily.
Yes. So if I remember correctly, we had only 10 responses from South America. So it's not strange if these come up quite high. So the 40% here of inclusion in South America, that's just 4 people, you see.
Yeah.
As for United States, or I mean North America and so on, that's quite different. I think that could explain part of it at least.
Yeah. Then a more general remark. It's for sometimes not easy to distinguish between, at least in my impression, what I wish that research should focus on and didn't do yet because it's really difficult, or it's more policy related, or there are other reasons why it didn't happen yet, or we wish this direction because it's not addressed by researchers.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. More generally, we've talked about this tension of within the discipline. If you take math education research as a discipline, it can only tackle particular topics by itself, right? Whereas the problems, the themes that people mention and want to understand better are often at least interdisciplinary.
Yeah.
So I think what this survey points to, for me at least, is that we may need to widen the scope of our journals to include, well, to become a bit more open to these bigger issues. But also, and maybe some of that has to go to other journals, of course. But yeah, how do you tackle the bigger issues where the mathematical content is a bit less visible?
Yeah, but even is it possible to tackle these issues with what is possible for us as a researcher?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly that's where I feel this other tension that I mentioned, that by knowing more, it doesn't mean that we can change the things better. Interdisciplinary work is not enough. I mean, put a science educator and math educator together, they may understand it a little bit more, but it doesn't mean they can change certain things better. So maybe we need to work more with policymakers or sociologists or well, you know what, educators.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. By the way, it's really a nice overview of all these topics and impressive work. So thank you for that too, for the presentation and putting this
very
forward on the
interesting
agenda.
stuff.
Yeah.
I sometimes feel very humble if I see all the things that people are working on across the globe. Then and it's mind blowing. Anyway, Anna.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of continuing this. It sounds when you provide that wonderful overview that this is a kind of such a strong call for a transformative type of science. And I wonder if there was any kind of answers which are methodologically oriented. Because I think that when we start to question how can we become a different type of science, the first thing are what are the available methodologies that can move us there? Because even if we work with the policymakers, but we still study like achievement between different groups, we're still there in describing things.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you. There is some mention of design research of transformative methodologies in the Russian style, so to speak, formative interventions, but not a lot. I mean, collaboration with educators is mentioned, but maybe it's because we asked about themes. If people made methodological comments, it was sort of spontaneous extra, so to speak. But as far as I remember, but maybe Linda has double checked it already in the Excel file, there is not a lot of mentioning of that.
Is there anyone else with a question or remark?
Maybe Jinfa could explain his comment in the chat.
Oh, is there any comments in the chat? I don't see it.
Sorry, it was not you. Sorry, it's Case. I'm mistaken. Maybe Case could explain his comment in the chat.
Yes, I can do that. I was wondering, I don't think it is a good idea to sit on the chair of a policymaker or sit on the chair of a change agent if you are a journal of mathematical educational research. I think you can have a good role in supporting policymakers by doing good research and use the standards you have in that thing. But you can think, of course, on what kind of research actually can help policymakers to improve mathematics education, and it would be interesting to think about that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a sort of poignant point for me because there are complaints about policymakers not seeing a lot of useful research in our journals. And but partly it is because we may focus on small issues, so to speak, from their perspective at least. And part of it is that they have sometimes strange views on what research is about and what it should deliver. So the whole evidence-based policy direction, at least in some countries, is like, okay, I do huge randomized controlled trials. If I know the effect size, then I know what's effective. And then we do that. And we only pay the schools who do that. I mean, that, from my perspective, is such nonsense. It's a very instrumental view, a very well, you take the human out of everything if you do that. So I don't think we should see research in that way. So, but what should it look like then instead, right? So that I think is still an open question. Some people have answers, like the networks in the United States, the kind of design-based implementation research. Those bigger networks where stakeholders work together. But that's just one approach to it.
Roger, can I say something? Okay, well, let me provide a little bit of background, and then I have a question to raise. Maybe could seek some feedback from each of you. So as us talked about, this work started with two journals try to collaborate. As a journal editor, sometimes the work could be very passive. Just sit and wait people to submit, then we review it and decide if we accept or reject, this kind of way. But on the other hand, the journal is so important for people's promotion, for people's, the communicating their work. It's the leading the field. But in some sense, in the leading the field is already, once the paper published, it's already 3 or 4 years behind already, because somebody already 4 years ago thought about that ideas already. So the issue is that how could a journal editorial team take a proactive role instead of a very passive sit and wait, but then we go out to not only to actively seek good research to publish, but also guide the field a little bit. So that was the question I have thought quite a bit when I interviewed for the editorship for JIME. And I don't know about the ESM, but for JIME, we have to go through 4 rounds of interviews, 4 rounds of evaluation to settle down one, the final one. So the JIME, we have been doing 2 things, try to do this a little bit. And one is that we wrote a series of editorials, try to put some current thinking there. And the second is that we try to proactively go after those researchers. We find those researchers could be potentially have an impact in next 5 or 10 years. Even though, we don't invite people to even though every manuscript have to go through the rigorous peer review process. And we find that those 2 approaches somewhat work. But this in collaboration with us or with the ESM is really trying to even build on that kind of somehow success, even could reach out to the researchers around the globe. Because after all, ESM and the JIME are the 2 leading journals in mass education. So how could we take a proactive role to guide the field of mass education around the globe so that we truly could make progress? So in that context, and the data Arthur presented probably could get some feedback is that how could we present the results in such a way so that it could truly guide the field? Otherwise, people will feel like, oh, look, you have the old skin, have a new wine, or new the new skin with the old wine, so sounds like same thing, right? So that's don't let the researchers viewed as those results as like same thing. Oh, I know that already. How could we avoid that? On the other hand, how could we present these thoughts after all from the experts in the field so that we could truly guide the field? So that's my question, 2 aspects. Maybe we could get some guidance from each of you so that we could present these results better.
Thank you. I see Michiel has raised his hand.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tim. It's really nice to also have this context of your initiative, and I think it's very good initiative. But on the other hand, we all know that who determines the agenda are the national the science foundations that give us the money to do research. They determine the agenda, and to what extent are you in contact with these national or European or Asian science foundations? And I think it would be also wise to see how they communicate or how they create their plans and their agenda and try to formulate or visualize your wishes so that they can understand them easily or can get into contact. So it's very good to try to reach the researchers, but in a way we are dependent of the agenda set by the science foundations, I guess, in a way.
Harold, Arthur, can I respond? Well, I think this is a very excellent point. And without funding for mass education research or even education research in general, we really couldn't move that forward because it's labor, even high research assistant is very expensive. So for us at the GIME team, we did do some work with the U.S. National Science Foundation. Luckily, the current assistant director is a math educator. We know her very well. So we have been constantly communicate those sets of editorials with the program officers. So in 2019, in fact, we received funding for holding a conference. It's really very consistent with what. So what would be the research about in the next 5 or 10 years? And I think I invited Arthur to come over to the conference, but because of the COVID, so we have to postpone. But that funding is still there, so we will see how soon we could hold that conference. But the point is that exactly right. We not only need to communicate with the research community, we have to communicate with the funding agencies. So, for example, when this survey results write up, hopefully is a very communicative kind of way, we could send that to the variety of areas, use our contact. The survey responds to use their own language to submit to the different agencies. So that work is definitely needed to be done. So it's really two ends. On the top end, we have to talk to the funding agencies and the policymakers. On another end, we have to communicate with the classroom teachers.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I add some experience about the pandemic special issue? So when this started mid-March in our with universities closing, Dave Wagner and I decided we should do something about this in research. And within 10 days or so, we wrote this editorial on the pandemic, lessons for today and tomorrow. And this was one of our attempts to be more proactive and encourage people to study what's going on and learn from it fast. And one friend of mine said, "Oh, this is almost journalism." And when we asked the advisory editors, so previous editors-in-chief, some of them thought we were going too fast. So research has to look backward and ponder and be deep and etc. But I think the big risk there is that we get slower and slower. And as Jinfa says, by the time it's published, you're 3 years down the line. So, and of course, you don't want to get rubbish. You don't want to have research, but I think we need to think also of ways to be faster without loss of quality. I don't yet know how exactly because we get more and more manuscripts. So that is one example I want to give. The other one, and I'm quite happy to see that downloads are huge. That was the effect size, the editorial that Jinfa also contributed to. I think it's by now something like 10,000 times downloaded. It's cited quite a lot. And I hope that within evidence-based policy countries, this is also read and we got some positive responses from Canada and Australia where people say, yeah, that's nice to hear a critical voice about this, and hopefully it will help them fight the national policies a bit. Like, here are 6 journal editors in the world who are critical about this, and use that as I hope it may work like that.
Well, at least for Europe, I can see that there are some calls that really connect well to many of the remarks being made, like calls on open schooling or the green call or on social scientific issues. But I think not for many mathematics education researchers, it's clear how to connect with, because it's so one of the things we could do, or you could do, is try to have some alerts on these kind of calls, and also immediately suggest, or that we help each other in how to how to apply for it from a mathematics education perspective.
You had a few points, Jinfa. So we've talked about a bit about proactive roles. Seeking authors. I think we also encourage people to submit special issue proposals. So, for instance, the one on racism we got a few years ago, and then there was some criticism that it was too focused on the United States, and we encouraged them each year and more often to resubmit with a more international focus, and they finally did. And it was sort of coincidence that it was just around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, etc., that this was accepted. So that was another way in which we try to be proactive. But of course, we could do much more of it.
But any feedback, any recommendations how we should present these findings?
That would be nice. Yes,
yeah,
if people
the
can.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Oh. Yeah, I could show you I could show some of the figures that we tried again.
I shared part of the results with the University of Delaware group here. And before we present, of course, us and I and Linda, three of us, probably we could communicate with lots of other researchers, try to get feedback. But for those categories, one of the feedback I get from my colleagues is that, oh, those categories sounds like not so new. We all know this. So if reaction is like that, then quickly they could dismiss our findings.
Well, that's an interesting one, right? Why should it be new? I would think that people should recognize. Otherwise, it should be a good representation of what's going on. Or what? Maybe you could say a little bit more about.
Okay.
This is not new.
Well, the comments, the advice I got from my colleagues is that on one hand, is those categories I really wouldn't be changed that much, right? It's like 3 meals is 3 meals, We have to have a nutrition, different kind of things. Not because in the COVID time we have to change it that much, or in a different time we have to change it that much. It's always the same. So those 7 or 8 categories we're using sounds like familiar, okay? But how could we present in such a way, even though those categories are very familiar, we all know it, but how could we present the finding in such a way so that it could enlighten people? Oh yes, that's the PD area we really need to work on. But not in the sense, okay, yeah, PD you need to do, so like a very superficial level or something. So how could we get the people to react to it? Yes, that's really we need to do. Something like that. So, yeah. So that's the advice my colleagues. So but I mean, maybe we could get some feedback as from and see how we could do that.
Yeah, so that Anna has raised her hand, so maybe we should give her.
Yeah, I'm actually thinking exactly this direction, and I'm not sure if it is so much expected, like ethics and technology being so interconnected with everything, right? These are kind of new things. And when you put the question like very instrumentally, how we can make people to become aware of it, I think if you take the content pages of the main handbooks in the field, they're supposed to represent main topics, right? What we have been studying. And I think if we just compare the titles of the chapters with what we get here, that will quite well show that actually the focus is changing.
Where do you see the change, if I may ask?
No, I don't think, like, if it would be conducted 10 years ago, I would be surprised to see equity and ethics at all between these in this like list. And I think that technology would be represented very differently, right? Because we study technology now for like 30 years, but it was topic on its own, and now it's more of a kind of an angle and a focus for each theme, and that's also new. And the question of goals, for example, of course, it's an old one, but if you pick up a handbook on mathematics education, it's rarely a chapter, right? So I think that's
Well, let's take the goals as an example. I've wondered, would it be possible to have a special issue or an editorial or whatever on the goals that we should strive for in math education? And if so, how could we not just have opinions, but as you see in the chat with Kees, underpinned opinions? I mean, Maya van den Heuvel wrote a paper about learning goals, and she thinks that research can contribute, but there is not a methodology for that, right?
Exactly, that's the thing, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
But so the paper could only be on elaborating methodology for studying goals. But that's a very interesting topic, and I can imagine we can something to borrow from, I don't know, sociology, investigating these streams within society to pick up what is important or something. I'm just fantasizing now, but I can imagine that the methodology could be a focus of a research paper.
What similar matter is that the one thing I have been thinking is that, is equity a part of a goal, or equity is an approach to reach the goal?
I love it because in ESM last year there was a paper exactly about this, equity as ideology or teaching approach, by Helena Roos.
Oh.
And in a way she's arguing it's both, right? It's something we strive for, but it is also something that you have to incorporate in your approach. You have to work on it on a daily basis, so to speak. Yeah. And I think that's often the case. I mean, let's take modeling. How do you help people model? By modeling, right? It's like speaking Spanish. If that's your learning goal, you'd best speak Spanish. Approaches and goals are sometimes really intertwined, so to speak.
There are two other hands raised, I think.
Maybe I can make a little comment. I consider, like Arthur, you were showing us one figure where you put the equity and other things on the top and rest were down. A little bit your handmade picture. Can you show me a little bit again? And I have a few comments on that. My feeling is one of the problems that we are facing is that research itself is a problematic, because we need to sort out into certain analytical categories. And when we sort out, we are compromising the phenomena. So somehow the danger is how to handle this analytical divide that is we are sitting, and still try to be much more faithful to the reality that we are trying to handle, which is much more complex. And somehow my feeling is that showing these equity and other as a separate categories up there, I think probably we are compromising them. So how could they go inside in all the elements as a way to handle this issue? That is one thing. Second thing that I am feeling is we as a math educator should be able to tackle this dilemma is divide between poverty and the economic well-off that is happening in the world. And somehow pandemic has intensified that strongly because many people are excluded in this process. So the question is, how could we reflect these two broader categories and how to make it much more inclusive, where we proactively engage with the poverty? Are the countries who don't have tools to introduce or make it as much more inclusive, and how to engage with them and how to engage with the world as such, and how to handle this analytical divide that we sit with when we are doing this. So it's just a question. So I'm adding a little bit more to the complexity instead of solving it. But my feeling is that maybe we can tackle this warp and weft approach. When we make a cloth, it creates like a threads, one is the horizontal thread, the other is a vertical thread. And if we bring these horizontal and vertical thread and bring some kind of overarching theme that goes inside, then it could be reflected very strongly into the classroom situation or into research situation or other situation. So in that way, we are not locking into analytical categories that much in that sense.
Yeah, it's wonderful how you phrase one struggle we have talked about. So starting with a list and then trying to do a matrix and then seeing that they don't fit in the same way. So what do you put here? What do you put there? And so, for instance, professional development was everywhere. And also, I mean, take using technology in the current distance education. You're concerned about equity, online assessment, engaging students. I mean, it all comes together at the same time. You don't want one thing we tried was a Venn diagram with 8 leaves, and then there is no structure anymore, right? I mean,
No.
what does it tell us? So the thing we're struggling with is how do we get some useful structure in this data or in the themes. So one extreme is tearing it all apart and have different labels. The other extreme is saying, it all fits together. Somehow we need to, and that I think you point to that also.
So maybe I can say something about that, because I came from mathematics research. That's what I did before this, and there it was very common to use this this classification of subjects that's sort of internationally established, and you can click on the link here in the chat. And I was just a bit intrigued, so I looked it up again, and I found that mathematics education is actually a subject here in the list of mathematics research, and you can find that they have. It's lovely how mathematicians do this.
It's the last one, right?
It is the last one. I don't know if that's an honor or if that means something else, but it's the last one, number 97. But if you click on it, you find it's actually pretty encompassing, so to say. There's a lot in there, and maybe that's just interesting as to mirror your ideas of categories to what they've done there. I always found it, I'm actually surprised because I missed it a little bit when I started working in this field. I didn't have that same overview of being able to say so clearly, oh, I'm in this field, this subfield, this subfield. Whereas maybe it does exist.
So do other people have something to say about our attempts? I see Lizzie is still here. We talked about everything on a table, right? Where the table is sort of something small in the bigger world, so to speak, or that we as researchers say or work on certain. I heard so I wonder, do you happen to want to say something about it?
Yes, I was actually wondering about how to react to the comments on equity, how to involve it more in all the aspects of this image. And I was wondering whether
Oh, Lizzie, did you disappear? Is it a connection problem?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
we can hear
yes,
now.
again.
Sorry. If there was a child or even a grown-up sitting and laying the train tracks, or setting the direction of the trains, and also setting down the trees, so you can imagine the same picture as a playground as well, or as something that is under influence of someone who has a view on it and takes decisions, then that could maybe represent such a thing as equity, which would then influence everything else that's going on the board. That might add another level, but I'm not sure about that, because when we last talked about it, this influencer would be the researcher, the teacher, whoever it is that, and equity would then maybe be something in that person's mind. You are still muted, at least for me, Arthur.
Yeah, thank you. So out of this process come future teachers who influence the process again, and perhaps policymakers come that also influence this process, right? So there is sort of this loop where, things feed back or so. And actually, one of the questions I have is what to call equity, and because it's a whole list of different things. At some point, I called them values, but Linda was not so happy with the term values. But it's something pervasive in the norms that we work on. So maybe as a change of subject, I wonder if people are sort of happy with the term equity to capture, or whether they prefer another term. And let me see if I can find here.
Actually, I think that, if just having an opinion, equity is kind of captures a particular vector in the development of values, to which we are very sensitive these days. So it is important. And I was thinking that it's indeed like a vector, right? It's like we are all under this impression, some direction, all the processes in your picture. And then that's, I think, what also Lizzie was saying. It's like in each mind and each child, influences everywhere.
Anyone else on values or equity or other terminology?
Yeah.
Ali?
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking that equity has been there for a long time, in a sense that it is valorized in the policy circles and other. But my feeling is the idea of diversity is not necessarily kind of, entertained that much. Because equity is a very much politically correct. But what I feel is that we need to bring this tension between diversity and equity together. So somehow it is not necessarily that we subsumed something with the other thing, but if we maintain this doublet as a way to recognize the complexity in itself. So maybe one idea is, can we maintain the categories that shows the tension between the categories as a way to recognize the complexity that we are trying to bring out through this survey? Perhaps that can help a lot a little bit.
So just to make sure I understand you, do you mean that rather than putting equity label on all of this, that we do equity diversity together?
Together as a doublet, actually, because it captures the complexity, because there is an inherent tension, and tension lies with the power and with the practice and many other elements that goes into it. So somehow maybe because we are trying to capture the complex picture, At the same time, we are not becoming more reductionist. So that can allow us to play this until we find out what other expression could go into it. So maybe one way to handle this, perhaps.
Yeah, some Canadians even have a notation for this. The what do you call this? The vertical line. So I forgot what it is called. A kind of stroke. I don't know. To show the dialectics between two terms, right? Maybe just one thing I mentioned before, and I wonder if you recognize this. To me, equity sounds like Americans, North and South, focus more on this. Yeah, I hear you laughing. And no, we should check it in the data. But as I said, I have the feeling that Europeans tend to talk more about inclusion and diversity, and not so much about equity. So I wonder if you recognize those cultural differences also.
I will go ahead, please.
No, Peter has a hand raised. Could you please jump in?
Yeah. I was wondering when you talk about equity, is because different cultures, they will have different pictures of something like this, some complex concepts. It's more describing like a field of equity or a landscape of equity, which allow different perspectives, because I think it's very difficult to put it with one concept. So probably, and not only equity, but also the other subjects you mentioned, I think it will be helpful to describe the landscape in some perspectives, and probably that will give justice to the complexity of all these concepts you mentioned.
Thank you. So, would you go for values or norms or society values, or do you have any suggestions? Because we really don't know yet how to sketch that landscape.
Well, maybe that's the problem with equity. I think probably, yeah, I'm not sure how to describe the landscape, but maybe some of these kinds of words that you see, that you think that all belongs to this landscape. In this landscape, we see values, we see justice, and so on. So a whole set of questions which are addressed in a field like this.
Something like, I would say, in particular discourse, it could sound like progressive values. But I want to give to Angelique.
Humanism, humanity, yeah.
Yeah. Angelique also had a hand, and I think it's nice to hear new voices.
Yeah, thank you. What I'm thinking is that another option for those categories is that in the current situation we're living in, equity, technology, and affect becomes the context of teaching. And then goals, approaches, and assessment could be seen as the process of teaching. So we have teaching, which happens within some kind of context, which may be around equity, a different role of the technology and affect. And then professional development could contribute to the actual teaching or the context around teaching, or the professional development could focus on particular aspects. So this is another idea of how those could fit in a picture.
Arthur, we don't hear you yet.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think what Linda made yesterday was this image where I think it's a bit similar to what you're saying, but not, yeah, maybe not quite the same. So you say equity, affect, technology are sort of the context in which the process of teaching takes place. Could you say that again?
Yeah, exactly. So teaching happens within a context which changes because of the current situation, and this context could be described by equity, a different role of technology than before, affect. And if we look at teaching, that can be framed around goals, approaches, and assessment.
Thanks.
So you say more of aspects that are particularly teaching oriented and more that come from a current change. So somehow separate them.
Yeah, right. So teaching which happens within some new context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it probably could help. Yeah, I see again hands from Ali and Rohir, but I'm not sure if these are old hands or new ideas. So if there's a new ideas, just jump in. But if there are also other people who maybe want to share with us, I don't know, maybe just simply their surprise with what they see or unexpected things in the picture, that's also very welcomed.
Just only a little comment about the idea of progressive. It is a very political term. And if we associate progress with the idea of technology, then it brings lots of risks because we know that technology has a risk also and many other things. So maybe it's better that we try to be a little bit tagging this idea with a question mark. It's the only thing. Thanks.
Yeah, no, for sure. Any political term is highly problematic for taking a position. Yeah, and Linda.
Yes, what I wanted to add to the approaches and the goals is that actually I coded them separately from the other categories. So it's what I did there was more thinking about how did someone formulate his response. Did a respondent pose a goal or really answer the question by formulating goals, or did he answer the question by looking how to approach research? So that's the reason why in the last picture Arthur showed, the abstract one, the goals and the approaches are on a somewhat different layer than the other themes, because I just looked at them differently. We just saw that some people set goals or wanted or thought it was necessary to set goals, and others thought more about how to go somewhere. So it's somehow coded a little bit differently. So that's just something from the data which might be necessary to add.
Thanks, Arthur. Do you want to comment on this?
I see Rogier's hand. Yeah, I mean, I do have a question. Let me just pose it and see if anyone responds. I'm looking for ways of classifying that are not sort of mutually exclusive, right? So looking for metaphors that where you can have smaller and bigger issues and nested ones, and you get the like with in biology you have those system thinking, right, of cells in organs, organisms, etc. But they are organized in particular ways. So maybe some version of system thinking, but that doesn't give you categories by itself. But yeah, I maybe Rogier should go.
If you want, yes. I have a bit of off-topic question then, but maybe not so very much off-topic after all. When I came to this seminar, I was expecting, maybe falsely, but somehow also to really roughly to hear what's hot and what's not. And on a slightly more concrete level than the level on which you are categorizing at the moment. So I'm just going to be blunt and ask you what's hot and what's not on this slightly. What have you found? What do many people really, what question do they really want to see answered? A very concrete question, for example.
Yeah, that's a nice one. Yeah, the trouble is it's so diverse. I already gave you the example of someone studying memes. If you have a few minutes, I can show you one. So that's something I sort of liked, and I also, but on a bigger scale, there is a lot on equity. Really, I mean, people are really concerned. And justifiably, I think. So, yeah, I don't know. The thing is, I think in the writing it will be easier to give examples than in a half an hour presentation. Yeah, and the other thing is a lot of people answer in very broad strokes, so not very concretely. Yeah, and I mean hot. I don't like hot and fashion. I mean there are bigger things at stake. So yeah. Okay, I'll stop here.
That's Roger. That's really the exact the question we have to pay attention to it. So if we don't have a specific things to offer or the insightful things to offer, I don't know how many people will read it. That's good. A good push.
It's always a dilemma of. Yeah.
Well,
Paul,
okay. Let me invite you. Well, after Paul, to put in the chat your wish list. I mean, I've put a few at the end. If you could put your wish list, I mean, of course, not your personal wish list. I want multi-touch screen embodied tasks or so, but you know, things that you really think that will help the field forward. Or
you mean wish list for writing out this paper?
What should be addressed? If you see all these themes and the diversity in it, we have to choose somehow, right? We have to focus our efforts on something. Yeah.
So the wish list for the future mathematics education.
Well, yeah, what the editorial could end with.
Yeah, so please really use our chat right now because you are determining the future of mathematics education in the field right now, advising the editors of 2 top journals. Paul?
Okay, so in the meantime, you fill in the chat and I will say a few words to let us not be silent.
You will the background music, Paul.
Okay, good. Well, well, first of all, in fact, if I look back at our discussion so far, I see different elements and maybe too many different elements. One element is where is math education research at present? Another element is where should it be moving to? How should it change? What are changes? A third element is how can the main journals guide or support this? And the fourth element is how can research impact on practice and on policies? Now, I cannot speak about 4 things at the same time, so it seems to me that the second one was the most important one, namely, where is the math education research field moving to, or where should it be moving to, right? And in my opinion, how to impact on policies or how journals could support these developments are different questions, which I would prefer to leave out at the moment. So then the question is, where are we going to in math ed research, right?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that from the themes, where are we moving to? I get the sense that people want research to have more impact and
Sure,
be more intertwined with policy making. So
sure.
it could be biting itself in a way.
Yeah, of course, and then everything is related, but still, I think the question of how can your field of research, no matter what it is, have more impact on society and on policies is a different question. It's an important one, but it's a different one.
Thank you, Paul. So we have a good old tradition that has not been really exercised lately of having a little borrel after the main meeting, a little reception. So you have a drink. And I somehow feel that we need one, basically also to continue talking. So I want to sort of have an official ending of this meeting so that we can say, okay, we stop the video. But I actually would like to invite you to just stay and talk a little bit more. If you don't mind, this is I like it if meetings stick to the official ending time officially, which we can do sort of now that we say it's over. But then we have the ball and we all stay and we just talk a little bit more. But then no one has to say, oh, I'm sorry, I have to leave now, because you can just feel free. But before you do that, I'd like to make a little bit of an advertisement for next month. I did that in the beginning, but I do it again. Here you find a link and a photo even. You can see our speaker is Martin Goedhart. Next time you follow the link, you see the subject. And you're very welcome also to subscribe to our mailing list. And then I want to give the word back to Paul, because his hand is raised and...
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
Forgot to lower it.
Okay, I just like to give the word to anyone. But first, maybe we can do a little applause also for the speaker. It's a good practice even with your... So thanks again, Arthur. And did I say everything I needed to say, Anna? Arthur?
Yes.
Thanks everyone for the inputs, and Jinfa, Linda, others for joining us.
Absolutely. It was very nice to have you as a guest. And